Hi everybody and welcome to the deep dive. In today's episode I'm going to run through the ins and the outs of hoses, quite literally. Hoses for your regulators, they might seem quite simple, it's just a hose, right? But when you go to the department page on a website, there's about 100 different hoses on there, and if you don't know what you're looking for, you've never bought hoses before, which one should you go for? Over time, hoses do wear out. Sometimes they get scraped or cut on a dive, but the first thing that you need to do is to work out if you even need a new hose at all. If there's gas leaking from the very end, either end of the hose, it could just be that you need a new O-ring or a Schrader valve on a quick disconnect. If you do need a new hose because it's the wrong length, you want a different coloured hose, or if it's leaking down the body of the hose constantly, or if there's a large bulge forming, or even a small bulge forming to be honest, it's best to retire that hose and get a new one. Some hoses do appear to leak bubbles at the beginning of a dive, and they have tiny little pinpricks down the length of them. This is fine. This is actually a feature as long as the stream of bubbles coming out of it stops after a few minutes. All that is really just air escaping from the central braided section inside of the hose, and that's perfectly fine as long as it stops after a minute or so. The same can happen before your second dive, where water appears to kind of leak and weep out of those sort of holes in the hose when you pressurize your regulator. It's just the water that's soaked into that braiding just being squeezed out from that air pressure. So the male fitting that screws into your first stage will be one of 3 different sizes. If it's for your gauges, that's the really easy one because there's only one fitting, and that's 7/16 inch. It's universal across all regulators in all countries, so that's the easy one for gauges, 7/16 inch. Low pressure hoses for your second stages, your BCD or your dry suit, these are typically 3/8 of an inch, that's the smallest fitting. All BCD and dry suit hoses, they're all going to be 3/8 of an inch. Regulator hoses are mostly 3/8 inch, but there are a rare few that are 1/2 inch, but these are very rare, but they are very easy to work out. If you measure the width of the fitting of the hose or the port on your first stage, it's very easy to tell the difference between 3/8 of an inch and 1/2 an inch. At the other end of the hose is the female fitting. Again, for high pressure hoses, your life is very easy. They only have one fitting, 7/16. Again, it's the same as the male, except the female version, but you'll need a swivel pin, a small metal pin with a pair of O-rings on it. These are typically supplied with your gauges, your SPG, not the hose itself, so double check that you have one. Swivel pins also come in different sizes. It usually doesn't matter which one you end up going for, but sometimes it does, so yeah, you just have to take your luck really. For low pressure regulator hoses, you'll have a 9/16 fitting. Most regulators are just that standard 9/16 thread, but they can be unique fittings sometimes, unfortunately, which really limits your choice of hose. Some regulators have swivel joints fitted to the end of the regulator hose on the feed to the second stage. Most of these are fixed, so you have to buy replacement hoses specifically for your regulator and have a technician fit it as well. These can really limit the style, the length and the colour of the hose available to you. If it's an aftermarket swivel, something that you fitted yourself, then it should be fine. They tend to be standard sizes, so you can fit almost any hose to them. The final type of female fitting on the hose itself is usually quick disconnect. Most BCDs and dry suits come with the correct fitting now if you're buying them from new, but if you need a replacement or a different length, then there are 3 basic fittings. By far the most common is often called DIN or international. Most BCD inflators and dry suits will have this type of fitting. It's the most common. 99% of BCDs and dry suits will have this fitting. But for greater airflow, you can find the slightly larger C-Gen hoses and the much larger Buddy. Sometimes it has different names. I just call it Buddy, which is required for breathing airflow. If you have an air integrated inflator where you have a second stage built into your inflator, so you can use it as an octo, it will have a larger fitting to allow for the greater demand of airflow. You can also get quick disconnect fittings for second stages and gauges if you want to be able to disconnect them from your hose. For second stages, it's mainly useful for full face masks, so you don't have to take the entire mask off when you're on the surface to be able to breathe. You can get lockable and just unlockable. With a lockable one, you'll need to kind of flick a switch or twist something and then pull to disconnect it, whereas the non-lockable, that makes more sense, if you're not paying attention, you can just disconnect it straight off. It's not an easy motion, but it can be done. For high pressure hoses, for your gauges, or if you've got an air integrated dive computer, then there's usually a screw fitting or a bayonet fitting, so you can only separate it when it's depressurized. There are 3 choices of hose body at the moment. The traditional one is rubber. Rubber hoses are tough and heavy, and they get the job done. Braided hoses are the lighter equivalent. Better for travel and often have a higher burst pressure, braided hoses are the modern preference, and a lot of new regulators come with braided hoses fitted to them. They are fairly rough though, which can be handy to identify hoses by touch. If you're not looking, you can feel between a rubber and a braided hose, but if your hose wraps around and it's kind of rubbing against your neck, that can be quite annoying. The newest is similar to a rubber hose, but instead of a heavy rubber, they use a lighter polyurethane for a smooth outer shell. Rubber hoses are good because they tend to sink in the water, they're negatively buoyant, and they tend to stay where you put them. But if you travel a lot, they can add quite a few grams to your regulator set. If you dive with longer hoses, they can end up getting quite heavy. Braided hoses, again, they're nice and light, but they are quite buoyant, so they float in the water if you don't clip them down, especially on longer hoses, because it's just more buoyant, so they can get a bit unruly. Polyurethane hoses, they're the best of both worlds. They're fairly light, but they don't tend to float, and they're smooth on the outside, but they are quite expensive. All low pressure hoses tend to be the same diameter, so for clips and things, they're all about the same and they should all use the same clips. High pressure hoses and polyurethane hoses tend to be the same also, they're about the same thickness, but high pressure braided hoses are skinny. Very, very thin hoses compared to the rest, and there are some hose clips out there that are made specifically for these to be a little bit smaller, but they are quite rare, so it's best just to use a bolt snap and a bit of line for a spool. The guardians of hoses. These are actually quite controversial and a bit of a personal choice. They are silicone rubber tubes that cover the ferrule, the metal bit of the hose, and a little bit of the hose itself, normally an inch or 2. They help to keep that section of hose from just bending again and again in one area and just wearing that spot. They are a double-edged sword though. By covering a section of the hose, it actually stops it from bending, which is what it's made to do, but it also traps water and other contaminants and holds it against the hose, and that can cause them to rot. What's worse is if you don't pull them back from time to time, they actually hide that damage so you don't even notice. So a lot of divers just end up taking them off and just route their hoses better so they don't bend at that part. At the female end of a regulator hose, you can fit elbow joints and aftermarket swivel joints. Fixed elbow joints, they allow your regulator to route out of your second stage at a fixed angle, so it's not straight out. They're typically 90 degrees and they swivel around, so the hose can go straight backwards towards your ear or straight downwards or straight forwards, just anywhere it's 90 degrees coming out of the second stage. There are also some 120-degree elbows out there, a bit of a softer angle, and finally you get swivel joints, which are just two hemispheres where you can adjust to get that perfect angle. The only thing is that you do have to remember that to make sure that they're done up very well before the dive, because they can unscrew themselves over time. If you're limited with a number of ports on your first stage, you can get splitter blocks where you can route one hose out of the first stage into the splitter block and then turn it into two or more hoses. You do limit airflow to each hose because you can only get a certain amount of air through that initial hose, but some splitter blocks can let you choose which way to send the gas. And you can find the opposites where two air feeds come in and then only one comes out. So you can swap between the two different air feeds on the dive if you want. Usually for full face masks again, so you don't have to remove that mask to switch gas. You can fit inline shut-off valves, normally to the female end of the hose, like right next to your second stage. That restricts airflow during a free flow event or something. So if your second stage starts to free flow, you switch it off, it interrupts it, and then you can switch it back on again. Again, you get lockable and non-lockable. So if you don't mind occasionally shutting off airflow accidentally and then just switching it back on yourself, non-lockable is fine. If you don't mind an extra twisty mechanism or something to shut off airflow if there is a free flow, then go for the lockable. On some hoses you can find heat sinks. They're usually fitted to the second stage themselves, not the hose, but there are some rare hoses that actually have heat sinks somewhere in them along their body. They're just a section of metal, a bit like a nut, which has metal fins that just help to warm the gas as it rushes past. Gas going from high pressure to low pressure gets cold, and that cold can freeze valves open, so free flowing, so it's handy to warm the gas wherever possible. Rubber hoses are typically black or yellow. You don't tend to get much variation on that. Black for primaries and yellow for alternates. With the invention of braided hoses, colour options just exploded. Not literally, they're perfectly safe. Exploded was a bad choice of words, but the choice of colours increased. Blacks, yellows, blues, pinks, greens, red, you name it, whatever colour you want, and sometimes even mixtures as well, if you choose the right market. In some circles, the actual colour of the hose has a specific meaning, but this is becoming a bit old-fashioned, it seems. They'd have a certain colour for a specific use, but nowadays it doesn't really matter. You can use whatever colour you want, and it's not going to confuse anybody. Just remember that at depth, the reds and the pinks, they end up turning brown. So think about your colour loss if you want to stand out in pictures under the water. The length of the hose is measured from end to end in most cases, including the metal section. If you find, or if you need to find the right hose length for you, then just use a fabric tape measure and just run the length over your body and your equipment, and that will get you the length that you need. If you're happy to wait, you can custom order whatever length hose you want. In some cases, you can literally say, I want this length, and someone will make it for you. But it will take some time. So over the years, we've settled on some standard stock lengths. A standard hose primary for your primary second stage is usually around 71 to 75 centimeters long. Octos, they usually come on like a 90 centimeter or 100 centimeter hose just for a bit of extra reach. Gauges are typically on a 90 centimeter hose, and BCD hoses tend to be around 65 centimeters long over your shoulder, but this depends on your corrugated hose. Dry suits, I prefer a longer hose to reach underneath your arm and then around your chest, so I tend to go for like a 90 centimeter or longer. For long hose setups, I tend to use 210 centimeters for my primary and a shorter 60, maybe 65 centimeter for my alternate that sits in a necklace around my neck. 150 centimeters can be nice for warm water diving on a single tank. You still have the length to be able to donate it, but with a thin rash vest, you will have just too much excess hose with a long 2-meter hose. For twin sets, you may need shorter hoses because your valves are literally closer to where they need to be. The same with side mounts, with your valves right underneath your arm. Your inflator hoses need to be fairly short, as well as your high pressure hoses as well. Whatever hose length you choose, go for it. You want it to be as short as possible though. Too much excess hose just bows out away from your body and just begs for something to catch onto it and cut it or just get you snagged in the water. If it's close to your body, then there's less chance of it getting caught. Most hoses are clean for recreational nitrox up to about 40%, so you don't have to worry about that. If you're using richer gas mixes, as long as you charge your regulators slowly and use greases that don't react with oxygen, then you shouldn't have too much of a problem. It's when you whack that valve open quickly and suddenly when you tend to get problems. But for recreational nitrox, you shouldn't have any problems. So hoses, once you know which fittings you need and the length, they're fairly easy to find replacements for, and remember to check them regularly as well. They do wear out and they do need replacing from time to time, and no, they're usually not covered by the warranty neither, so do be careful with them. And think about possible replacements when you're buying your regulators or your gauges. If they have a unique fitting, then it's normally a ball joint on the second stage that limits it. That's great and all, but it really does limit the replacement hoses, and the adapters, they can be tricky to find. So double check that you can get replacement hoses for it for years to come. Thank you for watching everybody, and of course, safe diving.